Richard Sterling thought he had committed the perfect crime. He stood in the center of the ballroom at the Pierre Hotel, holding the waist of a woman who was definitely not his wife, surrounded by New York's elite. He believed his wife, Isabella, was at home in her pajamas, oblivious to the fact that he was spending her inheritance on his mistress. But as the lights dimmed for the main event, Richard was about to learn a terrifying lesson. You should never bring a mistress to a party funded by your wife, especially when your wife owns the microphone. Richard Sterling adjusted his cufflinks in the hallway mirror, catching his own reflection with a smirk of self-satisfaction. The tuxedo was a bespoke Tom Ford, cut sharp to hide the slight softening of his midsection that 45 years of expensive scotch had provided. He looked the part of a CEO, powerful, untouchable, and wealthy. "Richard? Are you leaving already?" The voice was soft, coming from the kitchen. Isabella emerged, wiping her hands on a faded floral apron. She looked every inch the weary housewife. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. Richard looked at her with a thinly veiled expression of boredom. It was hard for him to remember that 10 years ago he had chased her relentlessly. Now, she just seemed like part of the furniture. "Yes, Bella," Richard sighed, checking his Rolex, a gift she had bought him for their 5th anniversary. "I told you, the charity gala for the Anderson Foundation. It's strictly networking. Very dry, very boring. No spouses allowed, unfortunately. Just the board and the major investors." Isabella paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. She looked at him, her eyes dark and unreadable. "It's a Saturday night, Richard. I thought we might watch a movie." "I can't, Bella. This deal is crucial for the company. If I land the contract with the holographic tech merger, we're set for life. I have to be there." He leaned in and gave her a perfunctory peck on the cheek. He smelled of oud wood and anticipation. "Don't wait up. I'll probably grab a hotel room in the city if it runs late. No point waking you up coming in at 3 a.m. "Okay," Isabella said quietly. "Have a good time. I hope you find what you're looking for." Richard didn't catch the double meaning. He was already out the door, his mind racing toward the evening ahead. He wasn't going to talk about holographic tech. He was going to the Diamond Gala, the most exclusive event of the New York social season, and he wasn't going alone. Waiting in the passenger seat of his Bentley Continental, a few blocks away, would be Serafina. Serafina, who was 24, an aspiring model, and who demanded the kind of attention Richard felt he deserved. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the silence in the hallway was immediate. Isabella stood there for a count of 10. The sound of the Bentley's engine roared to life in the driveway and faded down the street. Slowly, the slumped posture of the tired housewife evaporated. Isabella straightened her spine. She reached up and pulled the messy bun loose, letting her hair fall in a cascade of silk down her back. She untied the floral apron and let it drop to the floor, stepping over it with a cold indifference. She walked to the kitchen island, where her phone lay face down. She flipped it over and dialed a number. "It's me," Isabella said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the soft, accommodating tone she used with Richard. It was now the voice of a woman who signed 7-figure checks without blinking. "He's gone. Is everything ready at the pier?" A woman's voice on the other end, sharp and professional, answered immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling. The security team has been briefed. The seating chart has been adjusted as you requested. Richard and his guest are at table 4, right in the splash zone." "And the dress?" "Arrived from Paris this morning. It's in your dressing room. Hair and makeup are waiting in the guest wing." "Good," Isabella said, walking toward the grand staircase of the house, that, unbeknownst to Richard, was solely in her name. Richard thinks he's going to a networking event. Let's make sure he gets the networking opportunity of a lifetime. She climbed the stairs, her eyes fixed on the landing. For 5 years, she had played the role of the supportive, unassuming wife, while Richard built a company using the capital she had quietly funneled to him through shell corporations. She wanted him to succeed. She wanted to believe he loved her for her, not the Kensington family fortune she had kept hidden to protect herself from gold diggers. But 3 months ago, the private investigator's photos had landed on her desk. Richard and Serafina in the Maldives. Richard and Serafina at Tiffany's. Richard buying a condo in Soho. Tonight wasn't just a gala. It was an execution. The grand ballroom at the Pierre was a sea of velvet, silk, and diamonds. The air smelled of expensive perfume and chilled champagne. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering flutes of vintage Bollinger. Richard stepped out of the Bentley at the valet stand, feeling like a king. He walked around the car and opened the door for Serafina. When she stepped out, cameras flashed. Serafina was undeniably stunning. She wore a dress that was barely there, a crimson slip of silk held together by crystals, and confidence. It was loud, it was flashy, and it was exactly the kind of statement Richard wanted to make. He wanted every man in the room to envy him. "Oh, Richard," Serafina purred, linking her arm through his. She looked up at the facade of the hotel. "Is this the boring meeting you told your little wife about?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Hardly. Bella wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a place like this. She'd be worried about the cost of the appetizers. She has a poverty mindset, you know. Even though I make good money, she's always clipping coupons. It's embarrassing." "Well, you don't have to worry about that tonight," Serafina whispered, running a hand down his lapel. "Tonight is about us. And that necklace you promised me." "The silent auction," Richard nodded, patting his breast pocket where his checkbook sat. "I saw the catalogue. There's a diamond choker. Start price is 50,000. It's yours." They swept into the lobby, Richard greeting people he barely knew with boisterous familiarity. He felt invincible. He spotted George Henderson, a competitor in the tech sector, and steered Serafina toward him. "George! Good to see you," Richard boomed. George looked at Richard, then at Serafina, then back to Richard. His eyebrows raised slightly. "Richard, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought, well, I assumed Isabella would be with you." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Isabella? No. She's not really one for the high life. She prefers her garden. This is Serafina Vane, my associate." George's smile was tight. "I see. Charming. Enjoy the evening, Richard." George moved away quickly, whispering something to his wife. Richard ignored the slight. He was too busy scanning the room for the elusive event organizer. Rumor had it that the Diamond Gala was being funded this year by a mysterious benefactor known only as the K Trust. Nobody knew who was behind it, but the budget was unlimited. The centerpieces were real orchids flown in from Singapore. The gift bags contained Rolex watches. Richard needed to meet this benefactor. If he could charm them, he could secure funding for his struggling R&D department. "Let's find our table," Richard said, guiding Serafina into the ballroom. They were seated at table 4, near the front. It was a prime spot. Richard felt a surge of pride. Clearly the organizers knew who he was. He poured Serafina a glass of champagne. "To us," he toasted, "and to the future." "To the diamond choker," Serafina giggled, clinking a glass against his. Suddenly, a hush fell over the room. The lights dimmed, leaving only a spotlight on the grand staircase at the far end of the ballroom. The master of ceremonies, a famous British actor hired for the night, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, "please turn your attention to the staircase. We are honored to welcome the chairwoman of the evening, the woman whose generosity has made this entire night possible, the sole heiress of the Kensington estate and the head of the K Trust." Richard frowned. Kensington? That name sounded vaguely familiar, like something from an old history book or a dusty law firm. "Please welcome Mrs. Isabella Sterling." Richard froze. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the table, soaking the white tablecloth. Serafina looked at him, annoyed. "Richard, you got champagne on my dress. Who is Isabella Sterling?" Richard couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He stared at the staircase. At the top of the stairs stood a woman. She was not wearing a floral apron. She was not wearing messy pajamas. She was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged every curve, off the shoulder, with a slit that went up to her thigh. Around her neck was a diamond necklace that made the one in the auction catalogue look like a toy. Her hair was styled in glamorous Hollywood waves. Her makeup was fierce and flawless. It was Isabella. But it wasn't the wife he knew. This woman radiated power. She looked down at the crowd of hundreds, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto table 4. She didn't smile. She just stared, piercing him with a look of absolute, cold dominance. Then she began to descend the stairs, the crowd erupting into applause. Every step she took sounded like a nail being hammered into Richard's coffin. "That's," Richard choked out, his face draining of colour. "That's my wife." Serafina dropped her fork. That supermodel-looking woman is the one who clips coupons." Isabella reached the bottom of the stairs and took the microphone offered to her. The room went silent. "Good evening," Isabella said. Her voice was smooth, confident, and amplified to every corner of the room. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is a night of charity, of giving, and of truth." She looked directly at Richard again. "Some of us wear masks," she continued, her voice hardening slightly. "And tonight, I think it's time we took them off." Isabella stepped off the podium, the applause washing over her like a cleansing rain. She didn't look back at the microphone. She walked straight into the crowd, the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns parting for her as if she were royalty. She moved with a predator's grace toward the head table, the platinum circle table, where the city's billionaires, the mayor, and the CEO of the Anderson Foundation were seated. She sat down, smoothing her velvet dress, and accepted a glass of water from a waiter who looked terrified to even breathe near her. At table 4, the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard Sterling sat frozen. His mind was trying to reboot, but the operating system had crashed. Isabella, the Kensington heiress, it was impossible. He knew she had a small inheritance from a grandmother, enough for a down payment on a house, maybe. But the Kensington estate? That was old money. That was Rockefeller-level money. "Richard," Serafina hissed, her fingernails digging into his bicep, "why is your wife sitting with the mayor? And why is everyone looking at us like we have the plague?" Richard swatted her hand away, his charm evaporating. "Shut up, Serafina. I need to think." He needed to get to her. He needed to explain. Surely this was a misunderstanding, or maybe this was good? If she was this rich, then he was this rich. They were married, community property. The prenup they signed was basic, drafted by a strip mall lawyer. He suddenly felt a surge of greed replace his fear. He stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Stay here," he ordered Serafina. "I will not," she snapped. "I'm coming with you." Richard ignored her and began to push through the crowd toward the head table. But as he approached the velvet rope cordoning off the VIP section, a wall of muscle blocked his path. 2 security guards, built like linebackers, crossed their arms. "Excuse me," Richard said, putting on his CEO voice. "I need to speak to my wife, Mrs. Sterling." The guard on the left looked down at him. "Mrs. Sterling has requested that no one disturb her dinner, especially not guests from table 4. "I'm her husband!" Richard's voice rose, cracking slightly. Heads turned. "We know who you are, sir," the guard said, his tone devoid of respect. "And we have our orders. Step back, or you will be escorted out." Richard flushed crimson. Across the room, he saw George Henderson watching him with a pitying smirk. He looked past the guards to Isabella. She was laughing at something the mayor said, touching his arm lightly. She looked radiant, happy, and completely unconcerned with Richard's existence. Then she turned her head. Her eyes locked with Richard's. She didn't wave. She didn't scowl. She simply raised her glass of champagne in a mocking toast, took a sip, and turned her back on him. Defeated, Richard slunk back to table 4. "Well?" Serafina asked, her arms crossed over her chest. "Did you fix it?" "She's busy," Richard muttered, chugging his water. Then came the final nail in the evening's coffin. The waiter arrived with the main course. For everyone else, it was filet mignon with truffle reduction. The waiter placed a plate in front of Richard. It was a single, slightly burnt, grilled cheese sandwich. Richard stared at it. "What is this?" "Compliments of the hostess," the waiter said, his face perfectly straight. "Mrs. Sterling noted that you often complain about expensive food being pretentious, and that you prefer simple, home-cooked meals. She wanted you to feel comfortable." Serafina let out a high-pitched, horrified laugh. "Oh my God, she's mocking you! Richard, this is humiliating!" "It's a mistake," Richard hissed, though he knew it wasn't. Then the auction began. The lights dimmed again. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a gavel, took the stage. "Item number 1, he announced. The Star of Midnight diamond choker. Platinum setting, 20 carats total weight. Donated by Cartier. Bidding starts at $50,000. This was it. Richard's chance to regain control. He needed to show the room he still had power. He needed to show Isabella he didn't need her money. He had his own company. He grabbed the paddle. "50,000! Richard shouted, raising his paddle. "50,000 to the gentleman at table 4, the auctioneer said. "60,000, a voice called from the back. "70, Richard countered aggressively. "80, $100,000, Richard screamed. The room went silent. It was double the starting price. He looked at Serafina, sweating. "I told you I'd get it for you." "100,000 going once," the auctioneer began. "200,000. The voice came from the head table. Calm. Clear. It was Isabella. She hadn't even looked up from her dessert. She just held her paddle up lazily. Richard felt his stomach drop. 200,000 was pushing his limit for liquid cash, especially with the company's current cash flow issues. But his ego wouldn't let him stop. 210, Richard croaked. $500,000, Isabella said instantly. The crowd gasped. A collective murmur rippled through the ballroom. Isabella turned in her chair, facing Richard directly for the first time. She picked up the microphone on the table. "Actually," she said, her voice echoing through the hall, "let's make it interesting. I bid $1 million, and I'll be donating the necklace to the shelter for abused women." She stared at Richard. "Your turn, Richard. Do you have $1 million? Or did you spend it all on that condo in Soho?" The silence that followed was absolute. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. She knew. She knew about the condo. She knew everything. "Going once," the auctioneer said, sensing the blood in the water. "Going twice. Sold to Mrs. Isabella Sterling for $1 million. The room erupted in applause. Richard slumped in his chair. Serafina stood up abruptly. "I'm leaving," she said, grabbing her clutch. "Serafina, wait. No, Richard, you're a joke. You brought me here to show off, and your wife just bought and sold you in 5 minutes. Don't call me." She stormed out, her red dress trailing behind her. Richard sat alone at the table with his burnt grilled cheese sandwich as hundreds of people applauded his wife. The weekend was a blur of ignored phone calls and whiskey. Richard didn't go home. He stayed at the Soho condo, the one Isabella knew about, pacing the floor, waiting for the police or a process server. But no one came. By Monday morning, he had convinced himself he could salvage the situation. Business is business, he told himself as he shaved his trembling jaw. Isabella might be angry, but she won't tank the company. It's her income source too. He didn't know that Sterling Tech had never been his company. He arrived at the office at 8 a.m. The atmosphere was strange. The receptionist didn't greet him. The junior analysts were huddled in corners, whispering. When he walked past them, they went silent and looked at their shoes. Richard stormed into his office, slamming the door. He pressed the intercom. "Linda, get the board on the line. I want an emergency meeting in 10 minutes. "The board is already here, Mr. Sterling," Linda's voice crackled back. "They're in conference room A. They've been waiting for you." Richard frowned. He grabbed his tablet and marched down the hall. He burst into the conference room, ready to assert dominance. "What is going on here? Who called a meeting without my authorization?" The long mahogany table was full. All 6 board members were present. But at the head of the table, in the chair usually reserved for the chairman, Richard's chair, sat a man he didn't recognize. He was older, with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Richard's car. Beside him sat Arthur Pendleton, a ruthless corporate lawyer known as the Shark of Wall Street. And standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline, was Isabella. She was wearing a sharp white power suit. She turned as Richard entered, her face impassive. "Take a seat, Richard," Isabella said. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded. "This is a closed board meeting. Security." "Sit down, you fool," the silver-haired man snapped. "I am Elias Thorne, representing the Kensington Trust." Richard blinked. "The trust?" Arthur Pendleton slid a thick document across the table. "Mr. Sterling, you seem to be under the impression that you own Sterling Tech. You do not. You own 15% of the equity. The other 85% is held by a holding company called Aurora Ventures." "I know that," Richard stammered. "Aurora has been our silent angel investor for 5 years. They've never interfered." "Aurora Ventures," Isabella said, walking over to the table and placing her hands on the leather surface, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Kensington Trust. My trust." Richard felt the room spin. "You? You're Aurora?" "I funded you, Richard," she said softly, but the words carried a sledgehammer weight. "Every time you failed, every time you needed a bailout, every time you had a brilliant idea that cost millions, I signed the check. I wanted you to feel successful. I wanted you to build something." She leaned in closer. "I wanted to be your partner, but you decided you wanted a mistress and a bachelor pad instead." "So what?" Richard spat, trying to find some leverage. "I'm still the CEO. I built this team. You can't just fire me. I have a contract." "Ah, yes. The contract," Arthur Pendleton smiled, a predatory showing of teeth. He flipped the document to page 45, Section 8, Clause C, the Moral Turpitude and Reputational Harm Clause. It states that if the CEO engages in public conduct that brings disrepute to the primary investors, the majority shareholder has the right to terminate employment immediately, with cause. With cause, Richard whispered. That meant no severance, no golden parachute, no stock options. Bringing a mistress to the Diamond Gala, Isabella said, where the primary investor, me, was the chairwoman? That qualifies as reputational harm, Richard. You set me up, Richard gasped. You invited me to that gala, knowing I'd bring her. I invited you to the gala, Isabella corrected him. You chose to bring her. You chose to try and humiliate me. I just made sure the spotlight was bright enough for everyone to see who you really are. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat. The motion on the table is the immediate termination of Richard Sterling as CEO of Sterling Tech, and the seizure of his vested assets to cover the embezzlement of company funds used for personal real estate purchases. Embezzlement? Richard shrieked. That was a bonus. It wasn't approved by the board, Thorne said. We have the forensic audit right here. You used company accounts to buy the Soho condo. That's fraud, Mr. Sterling. We could go to the district attorney, or... He looked at Isabella. Or, Isabella finished. You sign over your 15% share to me. You resign effective immediately, and you walk out of here with nothing but the clothes on your back, and we don't press charges. Richard looked around the table. The board members, people he had golfed with, drank with, refused to meet his eyes. They knew where the money came from. They were loyal to the checkbook, not the man. Richard's hands shook as he picked up the pen. He looked at Isabella one last time. Bella, please. We're married. Doesn't that mean anything? It meant everything to me, Richard, she said, her voice finally cracking with a hint of the pain she'd been hiding. But you spent 10 years loving my money, not me. Now you have neither. Richard signed the paper. Get out, Isabella said. Richard stood up. He left his tablet. He left his badge. He walked out of the office he thought he ruled, passing the receptionist who was now busily typing an email entitled, New Management Announcement. Richard stumbled onto the street, the mid-morning sun blinding him. He felt lightheaded. He checked his phone. His company email access denied. His bank app, account frozen. He had one lifeline left. Serafina. Sure, she had stormed off at the gala, but that was just drama. She liked drama. He had bought her a condo. He had bought her jewelry before last night. She would understand. They could start over. He was still Richard Sterling. He had connections. He could get another job. He hailed a cab, using the last $20 bill in his wallet, and gave the address for the Soho condo. When he arrived, the doorman, a burly man named Gus, who usually tipped his hat to Richard, stepped in front of the elevator. Mr. Sterling, Gus said, his face stern. You can't go up. Excuse me, I own Unit 5B, Richard snapped. Not anymore, sir. The building management received a notice of seizure this morning. The locks have been changed. My stuff is in there. Serafina is in there. Ms. Vane is currently in the lobby manager's office, Gus said, pointing to a glass door. She's trying to explain why she shouldn't be evicted. Richard pushed past Gus and burst into the office. Serafina was sitting in a chair, crying. Her makeup was running. 2 large suitcases were beside her. Serafina, Richard cried, rushing to her. Thank God. Listen, it's a mess. Isabella is playing hardball. But we'll figure this out. We just need to... Serafina stood up and shoved him. Hard. You liar, she screamed. You told me you were rich. You told me you were the king of tech. I am. I was. I will be again. I just got off the phone with my agent, Serafina yelled. You know what's trending on Twitter right now? One sterling fraud. Everyone knows, Richard. Everyone knows you were living off your wife's allowance. You're a joke. Baby, please, don't baby me. I'm being evicted. The building manager said the lease was in the company's name, and the company cancelled it. I have nowhere to go. We can go to a hotel, Richard pleaded. Well, my cards are frozen, but I have cash in the safe upstairs. The safe is locked, Richard. They changed the codes. She grabbed her purse. I wasted 6 months on you. I could have been dating a hedge fund manager. Instead, I'm dating a broke, unemployed fraud. She grabbed the handle of her suitcase. Where are you going? Richard asked, his voice trembling. Away from you. And don't follow me. If you do, I'll tell the press about that offshore account you tried to set up last month. I bet Isabella doesn't know about that one yet. Richard froze. He watched Serafina wheel her suitcases out of the office, past the doorman, and into a waiting Uber. He was alone. He walked out of the building and sat on the curb. New York City bustled around him. People were rushing to meetings, buying coffee, living their lives. Richard Sterling, the man who thought he had it all 24 hours ago, checked his pockets. He had a dead cell phone, a wallet full of declined credit cards, and no home to go to. Wait. The house, the marital home in the suburbs, the one Isabella lived in. It was in his name, too. Wasn't it? He tried to remember the paperwork from 10 years ago. Isabella had handled the closing. She said it was easier that way. Panic rose in his throat. He needed to get to the suburbs. He needed to confront her one last time. Not in a boardroom with lawyers, but in their house. He needed to beg. He stood up and began the long walk to the train station. He didn't have money for a cab. He would have to jump the turnstile. It was a long fall from the Bentley. Richard froze. He watched Serafina wheel her suitcases out of the office, past the doorman, and into a waiting Uber. He was alone. He walked out of the building and sat on the curb. New York City bustled around him. People were rushing to meetings, buying coffee, living their lives. Richard Sterling, the man who thought he had it all 24 hours ago, checked his pockets. He had a dead cell phone, a wallet full of declined credit cards, and no home to go to. Wait, the house, the marital home in the suburbs, the one Isabella lived in. It was in his name, too, wasn't it? He tried to remember the paperwork from 10 years ago. Isabella had handled the closing. She said it was easier that way. Panic rose in his throat. He needed to get to the suburbs. He needed to confront her one last time. Not in a boardroom with lawyers, but in their house. He needed to beg. He stood up and began the long walk to the train station. He didn't have money for a cab. He would have to jump the turnstile. It was a long fall from the Bentley. It began to rain as Richard stepped off the commuter train. It wasn't a dramatic storm, just a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked through his expensive tailored suit, the only asset he had left. He had jumped the turnstile in the city, earning a citation he couldn't pay and a threat from a transit cop. But he had made it to the suburbs. He walked the 2 miles to the house. His Italian leather shoes, designed for boardrooms and carpets, blistered his feet on the wet asphalt. As he turned the corner onto Oak Creek Drive, he expected to see the sanctuary he had taken for granted. He expected to see the modest, 2-story colonial, where Isabella waited, perhaps angry, but present. He imagined he could break down, cry, admit his faults, and she, being the soft, forgiving woman she had always been, would take him back. She would fix this. She had the money to fix anything now. But when the house came into view, Richard stopped dead in the street. There were trucks in the driveway, not moving trucks, auction trucks. Men in blue coveralls were hauling furniture out the front door. His furniture. The Eames chair he loved. the antique globe bar, the expensive art he had bought to impress guests. "Hey!" Richard shouted, his voice hoarse. He broke into a run, limping slightly. "Hey! Put that down! That's my property!" He scrambled up the driveway, grabbing the arm of a mover carrying a lamp. "I said put it down! What do you think you're doing?" The mover, a large man with a thick beard, shoved Richard back effortlessly. "Back off, pal. We have a work order. Talk to the lady inside." Richard stumbled back, panting. He stormed through the front door. The house echoed. It felt hollow. The warmth that usually greeted him, the smell of vanilla candles, the soft lighting, was gone. The hallway was stripped bare. "Isabella!" he roared. "Isabella, where are you?" "In the kitchen, Richard." Her voice was calm, unnervingly so. He ran into the kitchen. It was the only room that still looked somewhat normal, though the counters were cleared of all appliances. Isabella sat on a stool at the island, reviewing a stack of documents with a man in a grey suit. She looked up. She had changed out of her gala gown into jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking fresh and untouched by the chaos she had unleashed. "You look terrible," she noted, scanning his wet suit and dishevelled hair. "You're selling my stuff?" Richard gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "You can't do that. This is my house. These are my things." "Actually," the man in the grey suit spoke up, adjusting his glasses. "I'm Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Sterling's estate attorney, and you are incorrect on both counts." Richard glared at him. "I bought this house 10 years ago. My name is on the deed." "Your name is on the mortgage," Isabella corrected him, closing the folder. "Remember, Richard, you had bad credit when we met because of that failed startup in your 20s. You couldn't qualify for the loan on your own. So I co-signed. Or rather, the Kensington Trust acted as the guarantor." She slid a document across the island. "The terms of the guarantee state that if the primary occupant defaults on payments or engages in financial insolvency, the trust assumes full title. Since you just lost your job and your assets have been frozen for fraud investigation, you are insolvent." "So you're kicking me out?" Richard's voice broke. "Bella, this is our home. We built a life here." Isabella laughed. It was a dry, humourless sound. "No, Richard. I built a life here. You just slept here between business trips and affairs. You called this house quaint. You told your friends it was a starter home, while you looked for penthouses in the city. You hated this place." She stood up and walked over to him. She smelled of rain and expensive soap. "I kept this house simple because I wanted to see if you could be happy with enough," she said quietly. "I wanted to see if you could be happy with a simple life, with a wife who cooked for you and loved you. But it was never enough. You always wanted more. More status, more women, more gold. I was a fool," Richard wept, dropping to his knees. "I see that now. Please, Bella, I have nothing. Serafina left me. The company is gone. I have nowhere to go. Don't do this." Isabella looked down at him. There was a flicker of sadness in her eyes, but it was the sadness one feels for a sick animal that needs to be put down, not for a lost love. "You have your freedom, Richard," she said. "That's what you always wanted. You wanted to be a big man, unburdened by a boring wife. Now you are." She turned to the attorney. "Mr. Henderson, give him the envelope." The lawyer handed Richard a plain, white envelope. Richard tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single check. $5,000. Richard stared at it. "What is this?" "I bought your grilled cheese sandwich last night for $1 million, Isabella said coldly. "Consider this your change." "Bella." "Get out, Richard," she said, her voice turning into steel. The locks are being changed in 1 hour. If you are on the property after that, the police will be called for trespassing. And unlike the board members, the police won't be lenient." She turned her back on him and went back to her paperwork. Richard knelt there for a moment, the silence of the empty kitchen pressing down on him. He realized with a terrifying clarity that she wasn't bluffing. She wasn't playing hard to get. She was done. He slowly stood up. He clutched the check for $5,000, a pathetic fraction of the millions he had squandered. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, down the empty hallway, and out into the rain. As he reached the end of the driveway, he heard the front door lock click shut behind him. A heavy, final sound. He walked down the street, a man with no name, no home, and a check he was too ashamed to cash. The alarm clock on the floor screamed at 4:30 a.m. It was a harsh, metallic sound that bounced off the peeling beige wallpaper of the basement studio apartment in Queens. Richard Sterling groaned, rolling off the thin mattress that sat directly on the floor. His back seized up, a dull, throbbing ache that had become his constant companion over the last year. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with calloused hands. The room smelled of damp concrete and the lingering scent of instant noodles from the night before. There was no espresso machine waiting for him, no heated marble floors, no silk robe. Richard stood up and shuffled to the tiny bathroom. The mirror over the sink was cracked in the corner. He looked at his reflection and hardly recognized the man staring back. He had lost 20 pounds, but not in a healthy way. His face was gaunt, his skin greyish from lack of sun and poor diet. The arrogance that had once defined his features had been eroded, replaced by a permanent expression of weary defeat. He shaved with a disposable razor that was dull, nicking his chin. He swore softly, dabbing the blood with a piece of toilet paper. Then he put on the uniform. It was a polyester monstrosity, a bright red jacket with gold epaulets that looked like a costume for a marching band, and black trousers that were hemmed too short. On the breast pocket, a cheap plastic name tag read, Rick. Richard Sterling, the former CEO of Sterling Tech, the man who had once bid $100,000 on a necklace just to show off, was now Rick, the valet parking attendant. The commute to Manhattan took an hour on the subway. Richard usually kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He was terrified of running into someone from his old life, though logically he knew the odds were slim. The people he used to know didn't ride the E train at 5:30 in the morning. As the train rattled under the East River, Richard spotted a discarded newspaper on the seat next to him. He picked it up out of habit. His breath hitched in his throat. There, on the bottom half of the front page of the business section, was a photograph. It was a candid shot of a woman cutting a ribbon at a new children's hospital wing. She looked radiant, her brown hair blowing in the wind, her smile genuine and full of light. Kensington Trust pledges another $50 million to pediatric care, the headline read. Chairwoman Isabella Sterling leads the charge for a better New York. Richard stared at the photo. She looked younger than she had when they were married. The stress lines that used to crease her forehead when he came home late were gone. She looked free. He crumpled the newspaper and shoved it under the seat. A wave of nausea rolled through him. It wasn't just regret. It was the physical sickness of knowing he had held a diamond in his hands and thrown it away for a handful of gravel. He had tried to call Serafina once, about 2 months after the fall. He had borrowed a phone to call her agent. The agent had laughed at him. Serafina? She's in Milan, darling. She's dating a soccer player. Don't call here again. He was truly alone. The Pierre Hotel was a fortress of light against the winter darkness. It was snowing, big, fat flakes that coated the city in silence, but outside the hotel entrance it was chaos. Tonight was the winter solstice gala. It was one of the big 3 events of the social season, the same tier as the Diamond Gala, where Richard's life had ended 18 months ago. "Rick, move it!" Hector, the valet manager, snapped his fingers in Richard's face. Hector was 25 years old, powered by energy drinks and a Napoleon complex. He loved bossing Richard around, sensing the fallen grace in the older man's demeanor. "I'm moving, Hector," Richard muttered, pulling his collar up against the biting wind. "We have a VIP rush coming in. Don't scratch anything, or it's coming out of your paycheck. And fix your tie. You look like a slob." Richard straightened his clip-on tie, swallowing his pride. It tasted like bile. A sleek Aston Martin pulled up to the curb. Richard jogged over to the driver's side. The window rolled down, and the smell of expensive cologne wafted out. Oud wood. The same scent Richard used to wear. The driver handed him the keys without looking at him. "Keep it close, pal. I'm leaving early." Richard froze. He knew that voice. He risked a glance at the driver. It was George Henderson, his old competitor, the man who had smirked at him at the Diamond Gala. Richard felt a cold sweat break out under his polyester jacket. If George recognized him, Richard didn't think he could survive the shame. He dipped his head low, pulling the brim of his cap down. "Yes, sir," Richard rasped, forcing his voice into a lower register. George didn't even blink. He looked right through Richard as if he were made of glass. To George, Richard wasn't a person. He was just a mechanism that moved the car. "Ticket?" George demanded, holding out his hand. Richard handed him the claim stub with trembling fingers. George snatched it, turned, and walked into the hotel, checking his phone. Richard let out a long, shaky breath. He got into the Aston Martin. The leather seat was warm. The heater was on. For 30 seconds, as he drove the car around the block to the underground garage, Richard pretended. He rested his hand on the gear shift, imagining he was driving to a meeting, that Isabella was waiting for him at a restaurant, that the last year and a half had been a terrible nightmare. But then he reached the garage. The concrete walls were cold, the illusion shattered. He parked the car, hung the keys on the pegboard, and ran back up the ramp into the snow. By 8 p.m., the rush had slowed, but Hector was pacing nervously. "Okay, listen up!" Hector barked to the team of shivering valets. "We have the guest of honor arriving in 5 minutes. This is the big one, the chairwoman of the event. I want absolute perfection. Rick, you take the door. Tony, you take the trunk. Move." Richard positioned himself by the red carpet. His feet were numb inside his cheap shoes. He rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to generate friction. A hush fell over the crowd of paparazzi and onlookers gathered behind the velvet ropes. A white Rolls-Royce Phantom turned the corner. It moved silently, like a ghost ship gliding over the black asphalt. It was a vehicle of immense power and dignity. It pulled up to the curb, stopping inches from where Richard stood. Richard took a deep breath. He reached out and grasped the chrome handle of the rear door. This was his job. Open the door. Bow the head. Wait for the tip. Close the door. Fade away. He pulled the heavy door open. First, a pair of black dress shoes stepped out. A man emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly. He wasn't a soft corporate type. He had the weathered, kind face of a man who worked with his hands. Dr. Lucas Bennett. Richard had seen him in the papers with Isabella, a pediatric surgeon. A man who saved lives while Richard had been busy destroying companies. Lucas turned back to the car, extending a hand. Profound tenderness in the gesture. "I've got you." Then, a hand in a long white glove took his. Isabella stepped out. If she had looked beautiful at the Diamond Gala, she looked ethereal now. She wore a gown of deep emerald green velvet that contrasted perfectly with the snow falling around her. She wore no necklace. Her neck was bare, elegant, and exposed. She didn't need diamonds to shine anymore. She stood on the red carpet, the flashbulbs erupting like a lightning storm. She smiled at the crowd, a wave of genuine warmth. Richard stood less than 2 feet away from her. He was holding the heavy door, his head bowed, his heart hammering against his ribs, so hard he thought it might crack a bone. "Don't look up," he told himself. "Just stare at the ground. Don't let her see you." But he couldn't help it. It was a magnetic pull, a force of nature he couldn't resist. He slowly lifted his eyes. Isabella was laughing at something Lucas had whispered to her. She looked happy. Not just content, but deeply, soulfully happy. Then she turned to hand the valet ticket to the attendant. She turned directly toward Richard. Time seemed to stop. The noise of the city, the shouting paparazzi, the honking taxis, it all faded into a dull roar. Isabella's eyes met his. Richard stopped breathing. He waited for the shock. He waited for the anger. He waited for her to point a finger and laugh, to tell her new fiancé, "Look, that's the loser who tried to cheat on me." He waited for the vindication of being acknowledged, even in hatred. But there was nothing. Isabella's gaze swept over his face. She looked at his grey stubble. She looked at the red polyester jacket. She looked at his eyes, and she didn't blink. There was no flicker of recognition, no spark of memory. To her, he was just a valet. He was part of the background scenery, like the lamp post or the red carpet. He was a service provided by the hotel. She had completely, utterly erased him. The realization hit Richard harder than any slap could have. He hadn't just lost her love. He had lost his significance in her history. He was a footnote she had already forgotten. "Here you go," Isabella said softly. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded banknote. She pressed it into Richard's gloved hand. Her fingers brushed his palm through the fabric, a touch that used to send electricity through him, but now felt miles away. "Stay warm tonight," she added kindly. It was the generic kindness one offers to a stranger. "Thank you." "Mom," Richard choked out. His voice was a broken whisper, lost in the wind. Isabella turned back to Lucas. She linked her arm through his. "Shall we?" Lucas asked, smiling down at her. "Yes," Isabella said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I'm ready." They walked away, up the red carpet, toward the golden revolving doors of the Pierre. They moved in a bubble of light and love that Richard could never penetrate again. Richard stood frozen on the curb. The snow was accumulating on his shoulders, turning him into a snowman, a statue of regret. "Rick, what are you doing? Park the roller!" Hector screamed from the stand. Richard blinked, snapping back to the cold, hard reality. He looked down at his hand. He slowly unfolded the bill Isabella had given him. It was $100, a week's worth of groceries, a fortune to him now. Small change to her. He looked up one last time. Through the glass doors of the hotel lobby, he saw Isabella handing her coat to the check-in girl. She didn't look back. She didn't pause. She simply walked into the ballroom and disappeared from his life forever. Richard crushed the bill in his fist. A single tear, hot and stinging, rolled down his frozen cheek. He wiped it away angrily with his rough sleeve. He climbed into the driver's seat of the Rolls-Royce. The scent of her perfume, vanilla and rain, still lingered in the back seat, a ghost haunting the leather. Richard put the car in gear. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He looked in the rearview mirror, staring at his own hollow eyes. "Yes, sir," he whispered to the empty car. "Moving it now?" He drove the car down into the darkness of the garage, leaving the light and the Queen far behind him. And that is the tragic, silent end of Richard Sterling. He spent his life chasing status, only to find that when he finally stood face to face with true worth, he had become invisible. It's a brutal lesson. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. Isabella didn't need to destroy him. She simply outgrew him. What would you have done if you were Isabella? Would you have said something to him? Or was her silence the ultimate revenge? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more dramas to life. And make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks for watching.